So I'm going to proceed with the first demonstration here. Basically, what I'm going to do after each segment is do a little demo on how you can use the skills that we have just gone over to make something, either an object or a scene, in Blender. I won't be doing too much lecturing or talking or narrating over this part, as it's mostly just to watch and follow along. I will, of course, have my key strokes being captured down in this bottom corner so you can follow along with what I'm doing. But this part is just for demonstration. Follow along or use those skills to make something of your own. But without further ado, let's get started. So I'm starting from this default Blender scene. When you open it up, you have a general template. So the first thing I'm going to do is just select the camera, delete, and light, delete. Just because we're not going to be using them, so they're a little bit in the way. Actually, I think I'm going to delete this cube as well. I think I'm going to start with a different object. So to add an object, in the empty viewport, just press Shift A, Mesh. Let's start with the cylinder. All right. Now, this is largely just going to be a function of what do we want to make with this. Thinking of making maybe like a little scene, so like a cartoonish scene. So let's start with this. Let's make a tree. Let's press 1 and let's move this up so that the bottom is sitting on this x-axis line. Now, this is going to be our trunk, but it's a little too thick at the moment, so we're going to make this thinner but not shorter by pressing S, hitting Shift Z to lock the Z value axis, and scaling it in. That's pretty good. Maybe it should be a little bit taller though, so we're going to press S, Z to scale only the Z axis, and just correct so it's sitting on the ground again. Alright, so this is a pretty good trunk. So now we wanted some sort of rounded bulbousy branch clusters, sort of like you'd see in the background of a cartoon. So to do that, let's hit 1 to go into front orthographic mode, just because it's going to be a little bit easier to work with. So we can either add the spheres here, or we can shift right click to move the 3D cursor closer to where we want them. Of course, it's not going to be exact using this method. Now we can press Shift A, UV sphere. All right, and now all we're going to do to make this part is just kind of scale these, make it a little bit smaller. And then now I just hit 3 to go into right orthographic because this is scooched a little bit farther forward than I would like it. I want it to be as close as I can to sitting exactly on top of this cylinder. So we're going to press G for grab. We're going to move it just so like this center edge that you can sort of see here is lined up fairly closely with this axis line. It doesn't have to be exact. It is organic after all. So now, to make this a little bit more tree-like, we're going to scale Z, just flatten this out just a touch. Now, I don't really want these facets, so on any of this actually. So I'm going to click this first sphere and click this, shift click I should say, to select all of it. I'm going to right click and press shade smooth. So now when we duplicate from these objects, the objects that we duplicate off of them will be smooth as well. Of course, I'm just duplicating by selecting it and pressing Shift and D and moving it out. So now it's just kind of a matter of arranging these objects so that they look somewhat sort of tree-like. Okay, that's looking fairly tree-like. It's enough for our purposes right now. Maybe scale these in a little bit more at the top so it has more of a tapered kind of look. But let's say we're happy with this tree. Looks pretty good. So now I want to make this one object. So I'm going to just, with the box select enabled up here, I'm going to click and drag. And if I join this right now, you'll remember from the lecture that this will be its new pivot point, which is not really ideal for what we want because we're going to want to move this around next. So with all these selected, if I just hold shift and press the one that I do want to be active, meaning the trunk here, it's going to make that one active. So now I can just press Control J. And now we have a whole single object. So when I move it around, it moves all together. It's called cylinder up here. Let's name it tree. Okay. Now, trees rarely grow alone, so let's move it along the ground here, and we're going to start duplicating it by pressing Shift D. We're going to rotate it around the Z axis to give it sort of a more random appearance so they don't all look like exact copies of each other, even though they are. We're going to make them slightly different heights. Actually, let's put these a little closer together. It's going to look better. And then, yeah, that looks good. We're just going to repeat that process until we have, well, maybe not a forest, but, you know, some nice trees growing in sort of clusters the way trees do. You can see some of these, because the pivot point is in the center, when I scale them up and down, they kind of shrink away from the ground. We'll go over how to move a pivot point in a future video, but for now, just place them back where they need to be. To hit Shift C to reset my camera because my cursor was distracting me floating up here. If the cursor is really distracting to you, you can always hide it, coming up here and unchecking 3D cursor. I recommend having it on in the beginning though, because you might get confused why your new objects are being added way out into the distance because you've accidentally shift and right clicked somewhere. So Shift C again to return that. Okay, we have some trees. They're looking pretty good. Let's put an actual ground for them to sit on so they're not just sort of floating amorphously onto this grid. I'm going to do a plane for the ground, which is just a flat surface. So Shift A, add a plane. And for this one, this is just going to be one surface. So we're going to scale it up real big. Now it looks like they're actually sitting on the ground. All right, what should we add next? Let's add some, like, I don't know, bushes? Could probably do that with the sphere as well. You can see when I hit 1 to go into a front orthographic, the plane disappears. It's just because it has no thickness to it. So when you're viewing it exactly from the side, you can kind of see it in this line because we're still in perspective, but it's just because there's no thickness. So you're just viewing basically a two-dimensional line when you go exactly into orthographic mode. It's still there. Okay, probably not the most convincing shrub you've ever seen, but I think it gets the job done. So I want to join these together and make it a single object, but now when I box select, it's going to select this plane as well. In order to avoid this so that this isn't joined to the plane, just deselect by clicking off of any mesh here, select only the plane, press H to hide it. You'll see it kind of goes dim here in the outliner. Now we can box select all of these. The plane will not be selected. We can choose which one we want to be our active. Let's just say this one. Press Control J and join it. And now this is one object. Rename it shrub. And you'll see that I've renamed the tree, and since I did that before I started duplicating it, it's maintained that name with the numbering suffix across all of these duplicates here. You can also rename this one over here, ground. Okay, so let's start placing some of these. Oops, with only the shrub selected. Make it a lot smaller. What you'll notice I just did is that I had duplicated this object and I moved it, and it kind of sank below in my process of moving it, but with it still lined up, if you press Shift Z to lock the Z axis, it'll snap it exactly to where it was on the Z over where your cursor currently is. So you can always select it, Shift D to duplicate, and like say you want it in front of this tree, but it's like lifting up and down off the ground, you can hit Shift Z and then move it, or you can move it and then press Shift Z to snap it back up to the plane. All right, what else should we add to the scene? Maybe some rocks. Some of these trees are a little short, maybe. Can get some more dynamic differences in the sides of these. We can also scale these whole things up by a single axis if we wanted to make it sort of a different shape. We can just, it allows us to get a lot more variation in these objects without having to actually model completely new ones. We didn't really go over this object. It's not one that I use all that often. It is a sphere, but instead of having, let me pop a UV to show you. Oops. Instead of having these sort of square faces on it, it has triangles, and we'll get into why this matters a little bit more later on, but it just gives it a sort of different look. So I've been using the UV spheres up until now because I wanted these to be pretty smooth. But if I'm thinking like rocks, you want it to be kind of jagged. So using only the skills that we've learned so far, I think an icosphere might make a better rock. You'll notice for these rocks especially, I'm letting them just kind of stick through the ground here. It's another good reason to have a plane is that you can use the plane essentially to hide all this stuff. So with a single rock model, we can use the transform tools to really get like a wide variety of different looks from the same, what is essentially the same piece. That trick is used a lot, especially like in games where you'll have, you don't necessarily want to model 100 different types of rock, but you may need them all to look different. Otherwise, it just looks strange in the scene. So, you make 3 or 4 rocks and you use your transforms and you clip it into the ground and the landscape meshes. So they appear to be different even though they are the same. All right. What should we do now? Add some like buildings of some sort to add a little more interest into this. Well, let's make this roughly like building sized. Something more like that. Just to make it a little bit more clear that it's like a building. We can add some more meshes to represent like windows and doors, things like that. This isn't really how I would construct a building unless I was going for this visual style really specifically, but using only adding and transforming objects, this is how you would do it. Like maybe that's a door. Make these windows a little bit shorter. Duplicate them along the axis so they're in like a nice row. Make this like that. Could put maybe the door off to the side a little, just so it's a little more dynamic looking. I feel like this window should be smaller. Probably most windows line up pretty well with doors, so they're not like crazy higher or lower. Scale some of these in a little bit and make them a little bit more realistically sized. Let's just make these. Add a doorknob to this just to give it a little more definition. So I can do that by shift right clicking to put the cursor there just so it adds it in the right spot. So do X 90 to flip it around this way and then scale. We're going to scale it all down the same way. Looks pretty good. Probably should be a little bit thinner. Oops, I meant to do scale shift Y to lock the length. A little bit shorter. And then just to make sure these are lined up, again, hit 3 to go into orthographic, and you can see that there's a little gap here behind it. So just grab it along the Y and move it in. And it's okay at this stage, especially if your meshes are like intersecting into one another. That's totally fine. Oops. You see my sort of zoom got all messed up there for a minute, so I pressed Shift and C to return it to sort of this default view. This door's probably a little thick. Can scale it in, move it out, move these ones back into it, and just make sure that everyone, since we don't know how to separate parts of a mesh from each other yet, just make sure everything is really where you want it before you join objects. We're going to go over how to separate like these pieces from each other once they're already joined, but that's for a future video. For now, we're just practicing adding and transforming. And you see, I forgot to shade this smooth, and that's really going to bother me. So I'm just going to undo out of that until they're separated. Shade smooth, shade smooth. And then make sure these are placed right where you want them. It could be probably shorter and thinner. Okay, let's not focus too much on this. Get distracted. Cool. So now when we look at it, oops. And you'll notice when I have this selected, the camera sort of rotates around the whole thing. When I have a smaller piece selected, the camera is rotating around my selection. And this is something Blender does just by default. So if you're ever wondering why your camera is not rotating kind of the way you want it to, it's probably because you have something selected that shouldn't be for your purposes. Let's give these some like window like frames so that they're a little more easy to see in our scene. Shift X to make it thinner. X to 1 so that we can see exactly how this is scaling. We're just going to line these edges up as best we can with these edges here. And these aren't going to be very exact because we're not actually into editing individual meshes. But again, purposes of practice, demonstration, this works just fine. But we definitely can make these more exact when we know how to do more in Blender. This nice sort of frame. So you'll see if two faces are occupied in the same space. Blender doesn't really know how to draw them, so you'll see this sort of flickering happening. This is called Z-fighting. It just means that you need to offset these slightly because two objects cannot be located, I should say, in the same physical space. It just doesn't make sense. You see it down here too, but we've already scaled the top one, so let's just duplicate that across the Z-axis. It's like a nice little window frame. You'll see that these aren't Z-fighting anymore because I actually have this ever so slightly indented here. You can see it right here. If this were exactly, which I'm not even sure if I can place it that exactly on top, it would cause that Z-fighting. But when you can still have meshes that intersect each other without that, you just need to offset them really slightly like that. A pretty good window. Okay, let's join this together by shift clicking all of the parts. And then we just want to make sure that the original window is last because I want it to have this as its pivot point. You can also go inside meshes in Blender. I mean, there's nothing really in here, but you can do it. If you just rotate your camera and zoom it, you can view the inside of this building now. I'm gonna delete those because it's easier to just duplicate this. And just a quick note, you'll see that when I pop into front orthographic view, you really can't see these little panes and frames that I've added anymore. And that's just because it's having a hard time showing you in this mode because this face is perfectly flat. So it's the same principle as viewing your cube. From orthographic mode, we can no longer see the sides of it. But if you're working like this and you've noticed that, it starts to get hard to see what you're doing, there's a really quick way that you can visualize this better. You just come up to here where these view modes live, and we'll talk a little bit more about these in the future. But right now we're in solid mode, which basically is just going to render everything here as this sort of flat gray color, which makes it sort of hard to see when you're dealing with a lot of objects that are overlapping with each other. So in order to get a little bit clearer picture, we're just going to hit the drop down here and come down here to where it says cavity and enable that. And it's a pretty slight difference, but it sort of just draws black into these inner sort of shaded areas, and it draws a white edge along these outer edges, and it just enables us to see it a little bit easier. You can also duplicate more than one object at once with just all the objects you want selected. Same thing as duplicating a single object, just press Shift D. And then if you want to move it along a specific axis, you can do that. D, move. It's pretty cool, huh? I'm just eyeballing these placements. I'm not using any sort of exact measurements at this point. We can get like, I don't know, some like stepping stones or like a path along here. That'd be kind of cool. I'm just trying to think if I should do this with an icosphere to match these rocks or a cylinder to make it more like paver stones. This is just largely a personal choice of the design you want. Let's just stick with the icospheres. It gives it sort of a nice faceted look, whereas the cylinder tops will just look quite flat. So this is what I'm talking about with like folders being very handy. You can see I've already started to forget to name things here, but we're going to start organizing this scene so that we can more easily manipulate these objects as we need them. So let's make a new collection. Click, and we're going to name it like trees. I'm going to put all these tree objects into it. So we can do that by finding them all here and just dragging them, or you can shift click them all to select. And then we can hit M on our keyboard to move. We can select the collection we just made or make a new one right here. But we already made one, so we're going to put that right here. So now that all these trees were organized into one folder, if I'm trying to make like a garage door or something, like right here. So I can You notice when I go into front orthographic, like this stuff is sort of in my way. So we're just going to temporarily hide that by going to the trees collection, and on the collection, hitting the I there, and it will just collapse all those things. So really quick, let's just make folders for all these object types. So like I mentioned before, no two objects in Blender can have the same name. Program just can't handle that. So I've just named this one window. Now if I select this one and try to name this one window and hit enter, you'll see that it automatically adds that numbering suffix for me because it recognizes that there's already a window in this scene. Oops, if I could spell. 0.002, 003, and so on. And this would have been much faster if I had named the first one properly and then just duplicated it, but I forgot to do that, so now we have to pay. Okay, now we can back to this. Now everything's named and organized, and except for some of these rocks here. Let's not call this rock, let's call this stepping stone. That's what it is. So we can also double click and then hit Control copy to copy this if when it's highlighted. Control V, and I'll speed it up. All right, now everything's named nicely. Okay, let's get back to working on this piece. In fact, before I forget, let's just name it. I'm gonna try to make it like a garage door, which might actually make more sense on this side. If you're thinking like design-wise, you'd want space for cars to pull in on and have this be the longest side, but I digress. Let's Control 3 to view the left side. Actually, I changed my mind. We're gonna leave it right there. And these buildings look kind of plain at the moment, so we can just add a little bit more definition by adding more cubes to it. So rather than adding a new cube, because I'm going to add some like columns and things to the side just to make it a little bit more defined. So I find it's easier when something's already sort of the dimension that you want it, at least in one or two of those dimensions, it's just easier to duplicate it, move it, and then change the dimension that is not the one you want. So because it was already the correct height in the Z, by duplicating this and scaling it in the X and Y, it's now exactly the same height as this and in the right location. Oops, before we do that, let's name this like column, just to make our lives a little bit easier. line this up fairly so that this dot is sort of lined up semi-accurately with these corners. And like, you'll notice that there's still some Z fighting happening here because this is the exact same height as I just described. But you also have to think about like, how much of this are you really going to see? Is this going to be covered with more objects? Is it going to be not viewable from the camera angle? And if that's the case, it's totally fine to leave it. Oops, shift. You'll notice in Blender, which is really nice, is that if you select something and like shift select and you're like, oh, let's say I wanted this, this, and this, but I accidentally selected this and this, you can hold control, do control Z will undo your selection also. So if you're like selecting a lot of objects and oops, you select that one, instead of having to undo it and then like reselect all of these, you can just hit undo and it will undo your latest selection so that it will maintain this selection here. It's really nice. A lot of programs don't consider selection to be, you know, an operation that way that Blender does. That's pretty good. So you'll notice that the way I'm doing these, I'm duplicating it and then I'm lining this green dot up to where I want it to be, because remembering that this is the pivot point, so this point's never going to move based on a, you know, a rotation operation or something like that. So when I rotate it by 90, it's pretty close to where I need it to be already. And then it's just about fine-tuning that placement. D and then X. It's not looking too bad. Kind of looking like, I don't know, maybe an apartment building or something. And I tend to make my models, and it depends on the scene you're working on for sure, but I tend to find it's easier to model things on the origin point because it's just sort of a default and it makes sure you don't have any sort of wacky values in here. I find it's easier to model things and then move them, but you are totally welcome to model them in place. You'll see, you know, some of these I've been modeling in place, like the windows and whatnot. That is just a matter of personal preference. Oops, scale, shift Y. That's way too big. I'm trying to make this like a mailbox. So yeah, you'll notice when we have multiple things selected, and even though these aren't joined, if I scale these, they're scaling together because I have them both selected. Down a bit. I'm going to bring back some of our other models just to see how it's looking. It's pretty cool. But I feel like I started out with more of a nature scene, and this building doesn't really belong there. So let's reconfigure some of these things to make it look a little bit more cohesive as a scene. You can see that because I was in an orthographic view, this tree started to float. So we're just going to snap it down to ground by being in front orthographic. So, thinking instead of this plane, we're gonna make this a little bit different. And this is just a design thing. It's not because of anything about, using Blender that is being limited. So instead of like having just a flat ground plane, because this is starting to look more like a city building and not like, a small house, I think what I'm going to do is make this more like on a sidewalk. And maybe have the trees just as like fewer, and then like maybe just like the little city ones you know have poking out of the ground sometimes, out of the little holes in the sidewalk. And then this is just a composition, sort of an art principle thing. Like you just tend to not want to have larger objects in the front because it's obstructing your view. So like this tree is a lot smaller than this one. So let's put this one in the back and this one in the front. It's just going to look better. And then also we want to make sure that like these aren't perfectly aligned when you're viewing it from the front, just because when you view it from the front, it looks strange. So just offset it a little so you can tell that there's two trees there. Obviously, if you know the camera angle at which you're going to be viewing this at, if it's not, for a game or something where it's live demoing, you only have to model and make objects for that camera angle. But this is just more sort of a general model, so we're going to make sure it looks good on multiple sides. I don't think we're going to need these stepping stones, actually. Oh, we didn't finish joining our mailbox together. J for join, and rename it. Now, you'll see that the objects I've added were added outside of a collection. It's just because we weren't in a collection. We didn't have one highlighted when we added it. So it just added it to the general scene collection. You don't need to have your objects in these subfolders like this, but it's just a really handy way of organizing it. We can always move it back to the original collection. Oops. Don't worry about that. I just pressed the button on accident. We're going to go over that feature next. Oops. See, like both times I accidentally pressed Shift D and then I pressed X, but since I was in right orthographic, we don't see any movement on the X because we're looking at it from that direction. So it appeared like it wasn't doing anything, but actually it was moving it this way. So make sure, okay, so I do still have the duplicate. I'm just going to grab it on the Y. That's what we wanted to actually do. Oops. I seem to have multiple duplicates, just delete them. And that was just from me hitting Shift D a second ago a couple times. Make this straight a little bit more narrow. It's like a shame to get rid of all these nice things that we made. So we're gonna like make maybe out here like a little green space for this apartment, a little courtyard or something. Smaller. I'm not too worried about deleting these objects because these are all duplicates of each other. So as long as I keep one of them, I won't have to redo this work really too much at all. Again, let's put this taller one sort of in the back for composition reasons. Maybe make this one a little bit smaller. We probably don't need that one. Okay. Let's like further delineate that this is kind of a sidewalk. Oh, I do have an extra one here. Blade it. That and that. Grab forward. How many of these do I have? Jeez. Okay. Sorry. Oh, let's see. How wide is a sidewalk typically from like the front of a building? I guess it depends where you are. This isn't like a skyscraper or anything, so we're going to give it a little bit of distance here. Oops. This is wireframe mode. We're going to go over this in a future video. I just hit the button by accident. If you do hit this button by accident, it's controlled with Z. If you accidentally get into this mode, all you have to do is hold Z, click back over to solid. But we'll go over that more in a future video. Let's make like a fence here to delineate this green space from this sidewalk. Let's do a cube. I'm trying to think of how tall like a fence like this might be. I mean, I guess it depends on the fence. This is a privacy fence. It would probably be at least as high as this door. Maybe a little lower. Again, not really caring that it intersects into this because when it's not selected, you can't really tell. If you want to spend time like lining these up very perfectly, you're of course welcome to do that, but I don't think it's necessary for the purposes of demonstration. Let's put some windows on this side. We're going to select this row of windows, duplicate the whole thing, rotate it on the Z by 90, and it's going to rotate all of these together, which is really nice. Time saver. Maybe a couple more on this side. Oops, wrong axis. I do that a lot. You'll probably notice I hit X when I mean to hit Y, and vice versa, because, you know, when you're rotating around a lot, sometimes you get confused about which way you're facing. But no biggie. You can just cancel it, right-clicking, And it'll drop it back where it was, and you can do it properly. Oops, just did it again there. Because in my head, I have it, you know, that X is left and right, and it is, but because we're on the side of this building here, I'm now thinking is left and right is moving these this way, but really it's moving it this way. Oops, that wasn't that. I just fat fingered the keys there. Z and X are right next to each other. Let's try to line these up with these heights as best we can. And give the impression that like the floors are actually there, even though, you know, when we go inside this mesh, there's nothing inside it. Just a lot of this is trial and error. It's just because I didn't really have, you know, a specific plan for what I was going to model for this demo. I'm just kind of trying out different things and seeing what looks good. It doesn't need one. And place it, and rotate, and then when you're in orthographic, you don't have to define the axis. It assumes, because you're in orthographic, that you are going to want to rotate around this Y here. So you just go 90 without having to press the Y-axis. Pressing the Y-axis is fine. It'll still function. You just don't have to in this case. So you can go into top. I like top view for placement. Just makes things easier. You can get a very clear view of what you're doing from a top-down perspective. That's pretty nice. Maybe like a chimney or something. A lot of roofs have like, you know, vents and things sticking out of them. So we're gonna add like some vents and things. I'm not gonna worry too much about proportions on these because this is sort of a cartoonish scene anyway with these trees. So it's okay if our proportions are a little large. Smooth. Let's add a cone to the top of that. Oops. Once again, hit that by accident. Or not so much by accident, more by habit, but we haven't gone over that yet, so I will try to refrain from doing that as much as possible. I accidentally had the whole thing selected, so we're just going to undo that duplication and that selection. Make sure only that is selected. Now we can duplicate it the way we want. Let's add some like cubes for like represent, you know, like air conditioning units and things like that. Kind of like stick out and give buildings like a more jagged profile. Let's put this one like kind of in the corner here, so it's like on the side of this building and on the top of this building. It's going to be more rectangular. It's probably a little too large. Let's scale it down and like make it a little shorter. Okay. Yeah. It definitely is starting to give more of an impression of like, you know, a modern sort of city rooftop. Let's like put one and like rotate it so it's more vertical. just to make it a little more interesting visually. Let's put some of these up on this one too. So the vents come out of it just to break up these shapes so they're not all identical. It's gonna look a little bit better. It's kind of look like smokestacks or something, but you get the idea. You're not really gonna think about the function of these that much when you're just looking at this piece, you know, as a whole. We need a door to get out here though. So right there, I duplicated this door in top view and moved it out so it was generally where we want it to be. But when I hit R and 90 to rotate it in the Z direction, you can see from the doorknob that it's flipped the wrong way. So in order to do that, you can just, even after you type in the value, just hit minus and it'll flip it around. Let's make these like double doors. Why not? So if I wanted to make this like a double door, I could do that by duplicating it across the Y, but we want to flip this doorknob so it's over on this side. And we can do this without having to remodel a separate door with the doorknob on the other side. We just click this and remember that it's rotated already. So we're going to hit S for scaling it. We're going to hit Y to scale it this way. And you can see if you scale it all the way in and flip it around, it's flipped around now. So this is denoted in 3D graphs by using negative values. So all you really have to do, if you want this perfectly a mirror of this one, hit scale, Y, minus 1. That flips the doorknob around. This is looking pretty good so far. If we can add like street lights. Sounds like a good thing to have. Let's start with a cylinder. Shift Z to bring it in. And unfortunately for the keystroke capture that I have that appears down here, it doesn't tell you when it's shift. Like it doesn't say the word shift out here, but it will have it in capitals because it's, of course, you make a capital S is to do shift. So that's what the capital versus the lowercase is. It's just the capital means I've pressed shift with that key. This needs to be taller by a pretty substantial amount. Something around that. Maybe that's a little too much. Get it from the side. Actually, let's just duplicate this. Again, I'm placing the origin of the object right here because that's where I want it to rotate around. Actually, I'm just going to hit R90, so it's exactly 90 degrees in this angle. Shift Y, make it a little bit thinner. And then if you want to quickly zoom in on any selected object, you can do so by selecting the object and hitting the period key on your numpad. See, it's right there. That will frame your selection. So you can, you know, if you're way out here and you need to get quickly, oops, you just hit period. Of course, if you do not have a numpad on your keyboard, this won't work. It won't automatically rebind even if you have emulate numpad enabled. I had to manually go and rebind this to the regular period key on my keyboard. But we went over how to change key maps. Although I guess we didn't really go over them, but all I did was go to Preferences, Key Map, type in Frame. Frame selected, numpad 0 is right there. Frame selected used to have it. It used to be numpad here. You just click this, you press the key you want, and it'll bind it. Anyway, resuming with this. I guess for this shape, can't really, at this stage, we can't really make nice curves or anything in this because we're just working with primitive objects, but we are, in the next video, going to learn how to edit meshes so that they're more complex shapes than this. But for now, we're just practicing moving, scaling, rotating, and adding, and joining. I'm pressing Shift-C to reset it, just to move the cursor off of it so I can see how it looks a little bit easier. Let that be my program. So remember to scale this along the local. So if I wanted to make this end here and here, I'm just trying to make it shorter, but I'm not really trying to change anything else. So just a reminder, hit scale and then double tap Y. Oops, I mean double tap, of course, Z, and it will scale it along its Z axis. And just remembering, fix our shading before we join them. Because at this stage, we wouldn't know how to go in and fix it after the fact. That's not bad. That's pretty street light looking. Control J to join. Now, you might get some errors in your shading when you join objects. We're going to go over this type of stuff more later, but if this is pops up like this, it's because I scaled these objects and I've joined it to an object that has a non-uniform scale. So its scale is 0.091 and 0.091 in the X and Y, and the Z value is 2.44, which is throwing off the way Blender shades this. So to fix this, yes, that will fix it. So click on the object, and then you're going to hit Control A to bring up this Apply menu. Go ahead and click Scale. We're going to go over more why that works in a future video, but for now, just know that if you have that wacky shading happening after you join an object, it's because your scale is not uniform, and Blender really doesn't like that. So you can see that after I join it, or I'm sorry, after I apply it, it has 0.091 here, Control A, scale. Now everything's set to 1, but the object itself hasn't changed. All right, let's continue with this. We'll make them as even as we can, but don't stress too much about placement of things. Again, don't stress too much about anything at this stage. We're just starting out, and we're going to learn how to do a lot more complex stuff and get things a lot more exact. Oops. Of course, on the Y. Of course, I didn't rename any of these. My bad. F2 to rename. Control V, copy, paste. F2, Control V, paste. let's rename this one to street while we're here because it's not really the sidewalk. Just rotate around the Z 180 by going into top R 180. And actually, if we wanted to maintain this exact distance between them, instead of duplicating one, we're just going to duplicate them all. Same way we did with the windows. Place it R180. And because this distance and this distance are not equal, and it's flipped the whole thing around, it is shifted over, but we can, no biggie, just shift it a little bit back so they're more lined up. Cool. We need like a car or something in this scene. And actually, let's just shift this whole thing over so that the center of the street is the center of the world. No real reason, I think it looks a little bit neater. And, you know, when you start to get a lot of objects in your scene, staying neat can be pretty critical. Now, this car is not going to be a total masterpiece, just because a car is the shape of a car is just much more complex than we're able to do at this stage, but we're going to get a rough idea of it. It's RX90 to rotate it 90 degrees in the X. Let's place them a little better and scale them so they're the right size. I'm going to leave this flat shading on here just because object shading is going to make it look, well, it actually looks okay, but we're still going to leave it at flat. Not too bad considering that all we're doing is adding and not editing any of these. Maybe the world's a little thin, but it's fine. So I'm selecting these, keeping in mind that I want to select this body of the car last because I want to maintain this point here as its pivot. And then just hit Control J. Now we have this as one object, which we can rename to car. I'm just going to go through some of these unnamed objects really quick and make sure that we name them, just to keep good habits. Call this vent 01. And we'll call this one vent 02. And then the ones that are based off of these same shapes, I'm just going to keep these the same names. So all the cube ones are going to be vent 01. And these ones with the little cone on top can be vent 02, which we only have one of right now, but we can add more if we like. And let's call anything that's like a cylinder with no cone, we'll call that vent 03. Control C to copy, F2, Control V for all of them to quickly rename. All right, this is starting to look halfway decent. Let's do these cars. Well, we don't drive in the middle of the road. Or we can even have them like, maybe like they're parked on the side. That's fun. Maybe we want one to be like a like an SUV, so we don't want, this trunk action happening. So easy to do. Same principle, adding a cube. Actually, I'm going to clear the transformation on one of these by pressing Alt-G. And so it's on top of the cube I've just added. And the reason I'm doing that is because I want to make sure that these two different types of cars I'm going to make it scaled appropriately. But see, it's getting a little busy. So let's really quickly, before we start making this next thing, let's do a new collection. Call this like street. And we're going to add all these objects that are blocking my view of what I'm doing. And press M and move them to street. So now if I hide the whole collection, Rogue Rock. It's just a little bit easier to see. So for like an SUV, we want it to be a little bit bigger than our initial, or our first car, which is more like a sedan, I guess. A little bit bigger, maybe not quite that tall, a little extreme. And then we can also move this back in the Y, so that it's not quite overlapping and we can still see it in perspective mode, but then when we go to orthographic, it's still lined up because we've only moved it in this one direction, which we're viewing it straight on. So yeah, maybe just ever so slightly smaller. And then we need to add like the hood part. So we're going to add another cube. Scale it. Make sure that it's scaled appropriately to the width of the car. Match. And normally you wouldn't make an object like this using two primitives, so you wouldn't have to worry so much about like this inset, but we are just practicing the skills we learned, so it is best to just do it this way. Make these tires even a little thicker. And line them up as best we can. Duplicate, select both, duplicate on the Y. Okay, not a masterpiece again, but it certainly gives the impression of like a larger vehicle. So we're going to select all of the parts that make it up. Select the main part of the car to maintain this pivot. Control J. And rename it car 02, just to keep it simple. Which means this is a car, but this is going to be car 01 now because we have more than one kind. That's just how I tend to name things. It's not really any sort of absolute naming convention. It depends what you're working on, the target platform for it and all that. So now we can have, let's see, have these ones on this side because I am American and we drive on the right side of the road. Now we'll see these going this way. All right, not too shabby so far. I'm not totally in love with this as a garage, so let's delete that and just make some more windows here because I think it's gonna look better. Yeah, it looks better. It's like a nice, and again, if you want to put windows on every side of this and, fix up some of these things in the back, you totally do that. It depends, what you're going to end up using these models for. So like if you're 3D printing something like this, you definitely want to make sure it looked good at all sides because it's going to print all sides and you're going to be able to see all sides of it. Similarly, if this were for like a video game, like a scene, like an environment, and if your character could get around to the back of these buildings, you want to make sure that these are finished. But if this is just going to be rendered as a still image, you can just leave it. We'll never see it. We'll never know. You need like maybe a little shop right here or something, because this kind of looks, you know, this has smaller windows, so it looks more like a residence, whereas like a shop would have like large windows where you can see displays and stuff. So let's make a shop across the street. Why not? We'll get crazy and make a cafe or something. Sounds fun. This roughly building size based on these buildings. Now, a little note about like scale and things. Because I'm not porting this to anything, you know, this is just a standalone piece. I'm not too worried about how it is scaled as far as the real world goes. Because right now, this building is 11 meters, which is actually probably pretty accurate to world scale. Maybe not exactly. The door is about 2 meters tall. That's pretty accurate. You know, but this whole scene could be any size. It could be, you know, this big, and it would still look fine because the scale is only relative to everything else in the scene. So if you're thinking about the scale of the scene as I have set it up, here's a door. Person would be this big. And then this would be a one-story building. Would be about, let's see how large that is by lining up our cube to it. Let's be a little bit bigger in the end. Sorry, in the Z. So that's about 1 story. It's just above these windows, like halfway between these two windows, and which is currently 4.88 meters. I don't know how accurate that is. Probably not very, but you want to keep that in mind when making like multiple buildings and stuff. You know, if you've established in this building that this is the height of a 2-story building, you know, if you have it wildly different on the other side of the street here, and the windows are all wacky and not lined up, it's just going to look strange. It's going to sort of break the realism. Not that there's a lot of realism going on in this scene, but, you know, even things that are stylized, you know, look like cartoons, there's an internal consistency about them that makes us suspend our disbelief in a way that, you know, when you break it, it just looks wrong. So this is about a 2-story building here, based on what I've already modeled. Which means that these cars are probably like wildly inaccurate. These are probably way too big. Those are just things you want to keep in mind. Like, these cars are gigantic, actually. So let's scale these down to something more specific. A person is about the height of this door, right? A little less. The car's lower to the ground, though, right? So you want to like, you can check these by putting these objects really quite, you know, close next to each other. So like a sitting person in this vehicle would be actually suspended pretty high up. And, you know, when you think about standing next to a car and like looking in the windows, you're looking down. So these actually need to be smaller. And again, we're not going for, you know, exact measurements or anything like that here, but these cars are actually, I don't know, what's the opposite of a clown car? Let's have some of these parked along the streets. Sort of at irregular intervals, so it looks semi-realistic. So that's a sedan. You want to make the height of, like, if you're looking in the window of an SUV, you're pretty much looking at eye level. I mean, depending on the car, but roughly. So eye level is probably about here. It's probably about like that. I'll have this guy sort of driving in the middle, not parked. So he'll be a little bit more towards the center. We can have some of these guys driving as well. Duplicate some of these. Make sure you rotate around so they don't get a parking ticket. I'm gonna have some of these. These ones don't, the direction doesn't matter as much because you can't, with this level of detail, you can't really tell what the front and the back is, obviously. So you can just duplicate these ones and make sure they're kind of set in the right place, as if they were driving along the street. Adds a little bit of motion to your scenes, makes them a little bit more dynamic. Let's add some more parked vehicles on the other side. These, one of these over here. Okay, so I mean, you get it. It's a street. We could put like a little median even in it if we wanted to. So why not? This is our creation. We can add whatever we like. If the grid is distracting you, if you've started building sort of under it like I have, you can turn it off, or the visibility of it, I should say. You can come up here where it says show overlays and click this drop down. You can turn off the floor. We'll turn off the grid. The lines will still be there. If you want to turn those off, you just select the axes that you wish to be drawn onto the screen. I'm going to leave it on because I like to have the grid as just sort of like a reference to like where my floor is and how big my scale is. I'm just going to select everything in this scene by hitting A. I'm going to come into either front or right orthographic view. It doesn't matter, but you'll see that the street, because of the sidewalk, tips down and the grid is being rendered over it, which is bugging me, but I don't want to get rid of it entirely. So I'm just going to grab everything again by pressing A for all, G, Z, and I'm just going to move it so the street is above the grid line here. So now we still can see our grid, but it's not being rendered over our street. So we just get a little bit clearer picture of what our scene actually looks like. Okay, back to this side of the street. Do we have like some fences here? Looks pretty good. And the reason I'm duplicating from over here instead of right here is, I guess just because it's already rotated the way I want it. So in my mind, it's fewer operations. I just have to move it and scale it, and not move, scale, and rotate it. Leave like a, make sure this is lined up, and leave like a little gap in this fence where like people could come in and walk in here. Yeah, I think I'm going to do it that way. We have our double doors here. Let's make this one object because we still have our single door, so we don't have to remodel it if we want to use a single door. We'll duplicate it from here if we want a single door, and here if we want a double door. So select both of these. And this selection order doesn't matter much because, I mean, it does matter. It's going to put your pivot here or here depending on what you have selected, but I don't think either is necessarily preferable in this case. So just any way you do it, Control J to join it. And now top mode, you can see we still have it highlighted through the mesh, which is nice because we can see what we're doing. S. I'm going to do Shift D. We're going to drag it all the way over. Let's put the doors over here. 90 minus. That's pretty cool. Okay, so now we need to make, we want this to be like a cafe or a shop. Let's make this have some, it can have the small windows up top. You'll notice that most buildings do, but let's have some like larger display type windows here. So I'm going to model these from scratch. And actually, because the scene is getting kind of busy, let's remember to rename everything nice. Median. Oops. Median. Put that in street. Let's put the cars in the street as street folder, I should say, as well, just because that makes sense to me. Street. How you organize these objects into folders is really up to you. I'm kind of doing it by sort of by object type, but also kind of by location. If you do it by location, like if you select everything, you know, in this back side of the street and put it in its own folder, you can quickly toggle this entire side on and off, which makes, you know, working with this side a little bit easier, but it's up to you. Whatever you find is most effective and quickest when you're modeling. Okay, so let's turn off street, turn off. And now that this scene is kind of pivoted away from the sort of more nature scene that I've started with, it probably doesn't make sense to have like the trees, the shrubs, and the rocks all separate. At least it doesn't to me. Again, you can make it however you want. Oh, and you'll see that because I had this selected, when I clicked add new collection, it added it as a sub collection. So you can definitely have folders within folders. That's no problem. But if you want to get it out, just drag it back up to the whole scene collection. So now I have this duplicate. It says shrub one. Let's just call this one nature. And then I have one rock. Yeah, that's really unnecessary to have a whole collection for a single rock. To delete a collection, just press delete. And then if you delete a collection that has objects still in it, Blender by default won't delete those objects. It will just delete the collection and it will move these objects into the scene collection. So if I press delete, you'll see that these are still down here. If you wanted to delete everything that was in a collection, you can do that without, you know, individually selecting them. You can select the collection, right click, and click delete hierarchy, and that will actually delete the objects from the scene. Okay, so now we have our nature in one folder, our street in the other. Let's call this one sort of building, I don't know, building one. Not very creative, I know. So right now these things are still in building one. So we're just going to make a new collection, not within building one. We're going to call it building 2. And we're going to just select all the things over here. Building 2. So now if I hide that, hide the nature, hide the street, I'm just left with this, which makes it pretty easy to work with, although having this might be nice. Anyway, you can move things around as you work, whatever works for you. Heading 1 to go into orthographic goes into the global front orthographic, so we're actually viewing the back of this building because it's rotated away from the front view. So again, just press Control and 1, and we'll see the front of this building, even though it is the back of the world space. This is a little off. Some little adjustments there. Okay, so now let's make our like store window. So let's set the cursor right here. And kind of the same way as we made the other ones, but just a different size, a different shape. I'll see, I'll probably hit 1 on accident a lot because I'm so used to snapping into the front, but we actually want to be snapping into the back. look better. We have like, oops, not delete, Shift D and then X. We have a couple there. And right there. Again, a lot of this is just trial and error. You know, you add a thing, see if it looks good. If it doesn't, you rework it. Actually, I don't know why I duplicated these already. I'm gonna add more detail to this window before I place them. So let's just start with this one. So I didn't move my 3D cursor, so it added this over here, but it's fine, just move it. And we'll make these both a little bit shorter, so select them both, scale, Z for Z. This frame looks really nice, but let's push it back a little so it's more in line with the window itself. And this window can be a lot thinner. This would be like the glass part of the window, right? So you'd want it to be pretty thin. Debating whether we should put some like vertical panes just to give this really just more visual interest than it has. Let's try it out and see how it looks. And these aren't have to be super accurate. Oops. Just selecting all the panes and then selecting the sort of glass part, LJ, just to maintain that. Okay, it's not looking too bad. Let's bring back some of our things. Okay, cool. Let's, before we forget, we're gonna name, oops, caps lock was on, name this shop window to differentiate it from the other windows. 15X, oops, can't see what I'm doing. So if you duplicate something with Shift D and you right click and drop it, it doesn't cancel the duplicate operation, it only cancels the movement part of it. So that duplicate is still there, it's just on top of the original. So if I hit G and then X, move it out, you see the original is still there, and there's my duplicate. So just keep that in mind. You know, if you're undoing a lot and dropping a lot of selections, you might end up with some duplicates, which will maybe cause some frustration for you. I don't know. All right, cool. It's like a shop window. I'm gonna just hide building 01 because I keep getting in the way when I look at it from more of a street angle. And we can I mentioned before, like we can have subfolders, so we can have this whole thing be street. We can add, right click on it, add a new collection. It'll start here as street. It'll be whatever this name is plus the number suffix. So if we wanted to have the cars in their own folder within the street folder, we can make that folder, name it, select all the cars, move them to street, and now you'll get this little pop-out window that has, now do you want it in the base folder or do you want it in the subfolder you just made? And we want it in the subfolder. So now we can have the street on and just turn the cars off. Same thing with the street lights. Let's do that again because it'll make it our scene a little bit easier to look around in. All the street lights. Select the street lights. You can also drag and drop them and move them that way. Then we can turn just the street lights off, but we still have the street folder on. Cool. I'm gonna make little make this like a cafe, you know? So we need a door that goes out from the building onto this patio. So like this would be the interior part with the seating. I don't know, maybe the kitchen's back here. I haven't really planned out that much, but when viewing it from the outside, you want to make sure you have doors to places that people need to access, because it will just look wrong if you don't. And okay, so if this is like your outdoor dining area, we're gonna place little tables in here. So let's do that. I'm gonna reset my orientation. I'm gonna turn off the street entirely, and I'm just gonna and the nature. I'm just gonna build this. Actually, I'm just gonna turn off everything because it's in my way. I'm just gonna build a little table, maybe like a round one. And I'm not worried about the scale right now because I can, as long as the proportions are correct, I can scale it up and down when I'm placing it. So let's do that with another cylinder, not a cube. I just want this, this red line, the x-axis, is just going to act as my ground plane here as a reference for what I'm modeling. So I'm trying to line it up as if this were the ground. I did that really fast. It was just selecting these, Shift-D to duplicate, R for rotate, Z for the Z-axis, and then 90 to flip it exactly 90 degrees, which leaves us with these two. That's pretty good. So if you have a table, we need a chair. But first, actually, let's join these objects, making sure the active one is where we want the pivot. Rename it table. And now we can do a chair. Move this aside a little bit because it's going to add our new objects right here where the 3D cursor is. We're going to make a chair out of a cube. So that's a little off, which is probably going to bug me, but it should be fine. I don't think you're going to notice when you're looking at the whole scene, but obviously if yours is off and you want it to be exact, just make sure it's exact before everything is where you want it before you join this object together. I'm just using a combination of scale on the Z and grab on the Z to get these legs placed correctly. Or at least this one, and then once this one is placed where I want it, duplicate it along one axis at a time. Duplicate both of these at once. And we have little legs for our chair. That's pretty good. Maybe it's a little wide though, so scale that in and then grab for these ones to move them in a little bit. That's better. I mean, if you think about a person sitting here, you need clearance for their legs. Maybe it's a little short. So we can just select these two and grab Z to move them up. And then delete these because it's quicker, I think, to get one in the scale and proportions you want it, and then just duplicate it. That's better. All right. Join all these. Rename chair. Okay, so if we unhide the rest of our scene now, or at least most of it. Where'd our table go? There it is. It's sort of sunk down into the street, so because that's where the origin of the world is. So we're just going to place it the way we've been placing everything else. G key, moving it up. And then once again, just check the scale of it by placing these next to like a door. A door is a great reference for scale because everyone knows how big doors typically are. That looks about right. Maybe a little small. You just scale these up a little bit. So Shift Z so it doesn't lift off the ground because it's where I want it in the up and down direction. And let's go into top view. This is our chair. Just select it, rotate it to place more chairs around. And for this, I really recommend that you don't place things like at exact angles because that's just not how things are placed in real life. Nothing is really that exact. So it looks a little bit more natural when you have these things slightly off of like, you know, exact 90-degree rotations. Okay, so let's select these objects, Shift D, and then Shift Z. You can rotate them around their Z axis to give them some different configurations. Maybe delete one of these. Oops. Delete one of these. Let's put this one, grab Shift Z, back in this corner, rotate Z. You could definitely join these objects together. Objects do not have to be touching to be joined. I'm just not doing that here because I want to be able to vary the amount of chairs that are sort of at each table. If they're joined, I won't be able to do that. Okay. Let's put this door 90 and then minus to flip it. Let's put this door actually in this corner because I think it makes more sense. Same thing with rotating on an axis. You don't have to select the axis you want to rotate on before you select how much you want to rotate it. So like with all those selected, you can say I hit R and then 90 and it flipped it in kind of this funky way because I'm not in an orthographic viewport, I'm in a user, and it's trying to interpret how to flip it 90 degrees based on my camera angle. But obviously I don't want that, so I can hit R and 90, and then before I click to confirm, if I just hit Z, it'll snap it to the axis, the same way it would if you hit Z before you entered 90. Okay, that's on the ground. Yeah, not too bad. Maybe we want like some awnings or something along here. Place a cursor. Let's do it with a, I think cube is the best shape in this scenario. See, this is the inside, but I'm just trying to line it up. I mean, I guess I should probably just go into right orthographic to make it exact. If you just line it up manually, even if it's like pretty close, because it's still in perspective, you're gonna get like some wonky rotations, which are more apparent the more you do it. So either lock the access by clicking X, Y, or Z on your keyboard, or go into an orthographic mode where it's, you know, the way you can see it and rotate it that way. Some more of these along here. That's pretty good. Let's put like, of course, forgot to rename them. Copy, the name, F2, paste. The F2 also works even if you're not in the viewport, even if you're hovering over the outliner, you can hit F2 and it'll pull up the input right here. So Blender knows where your cursor is, and it just won't pull up that box here. It'll just use this one here. There'd probably be like a sign over the door. So because I'm going to use a cube for the sign, I'm just going to duplicate it from this awning because it's roughly already the right size. Roughly. I mean, it's closer to the right size than a default cube would be. You can imagine if, you had a texture on it, it would have the sign. I'm just going to finish this up by putting some of these, these column type things around this one, just because buildings in the real world don't really just come to these exact things. There's lots of trim and details, things that you probably don't even really notice just day to day, but when they're not there, it looks very strange. I'm just using these sort of lines as a guide for where these get placed, and then checking them in perspective mode to make sure they're actually where I want them. So we're getting a bit of Z fighting with this wall, so to solve that, we're just going to grab that, pull this ever so slightly out, and scale this one ever so slightly out so that we don't get that flickering, awful flickering look. Check this wall. No Z fighting, looks good. Well, a little bit of Z fighting. Fix that really quick. Okay. And you just continue with that same process. And this, since it continues, can even just be one piece. So we can move it over. Oops. Scale on the X. Because these line up, or they're supposed to line up. You can see you can take your time with this and get really exact if you choose to. It's just kind of a matter of patience and trial and error. So when you duplicate these objects that are already in a folder, by default, the duplicates that you make are going to stay in that same folder. So like, even though this window is part of building 2, because we duplicated it from building 1, you'll see that this window is in that folder. So just remember to try to stay organized, move your objects around. I think, did we move this one even? Yeah, so just make sure as you're going along to move things around and put them in the folders that they need to be in. Let's kind of line this up at the top of the door roughly. trying to fix some of this Z fighting here by nudging these in ever so slightly. And again, it doesn't really matter if these are flush with this ground or coming through it a little bit. For the purposes of this piece, that's not an issue. I'm going to use one right here to cover this sort of line that separates these two cubes. I'm going to keep it roughly in line with this, so if you're looking at it from this angle, it doesn't look totally wacky. You can line it up more exactly. And this just needs to be a little bit wider to line up with this, actually. You know, for most of these things, you can have these be exactly the same width and height and things like that. And if you were doing, you know, architectural visualization, which you can totally do in Blender, you know, obviously you'd want those values to be exact and to scale with the real world. But this is just kind of more of an art scene, so we're not going to worry too much about exact measurements. Not too bad. Pull that out so it's a little more defined right there. And then let's see what we can do. We can scale this down so it's ever so slightly, just to avoid that awful flickering. I'm actually going to move this in because I think it looks so funny, sticking out and making sort of all these corners like that. Okay. Let's bring back everything. Just take a look at it. You can also hide things by checking this check mark. The difference is that if you rendered this image, it would also not appear if you didn't have this check mark tick. But we'll get to that and what that means more later. For now, just use the eyes. Looks pretty good. So you can see that even with the most basic tools of Blender, we didn't actually edit any of these meshes in the most strict sense. All we did was add objects, move, scale, rotate them, and join them together. We got this like fairly complex scene just with those. So I'm going to wrap up the demonstration here. I think you get the idea, and you can see that, you know, it's just really a matter of patience, of trial and error. You can get some really intricate things, even with those simple functions. And in the next video, we're going to be covering more complex functions, how to edit these meshes to get shapes other than, you know, these primitive cubes, spheres, cones, and things like that. So that's it for this one, and we'll see you in the next video.